Great.
Thank you all for coming again. And for new people, we have a few Zoom basics just to make sure you're familiar with. You are automatically muted and your video is not showing to us. So feel free to have the snack, an afternoon tea, and don't forget about the Q&A tab or your chat at the bottom of the screen. Please share your questions with us throughout the presentation. At any time you think of a question, don't hesitate to ask. The Q&A works really good for that. What we do is we can see it pop up and then we'll try to answer it live or type in the answer. And it saves it for us. Sometimes in the chat, it'll disappear if it's too far. And then we will open up the chat so that we can answer questions as we go. So this is a family program, and so please keep questions on topic as we go. And we are going to talk about being an ethical angler all the way from your house and having clean water. And with that, I will let Sarah introduce herself and actually have her take it away.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Perfect, okay. Thank you. So as Abby said, my name is Sarah Ghetto. I work for Clark County Water Quality. I have a bachelor's in geoscience from UC Riverside and a master's in geoscience from UNLV. I've worked for the US Geological Survey here in Southern Nevada doing various hydrologic studies, mostly in the Nevada National Security Site. And I've been in my current role of environmental planner for about 3 years. All right, so if you'd like to get started, I am going to talk to you guys about clean water and a little bit about some of the regulatory programs that are going on in the Valley to keep our water clean, and kind of just a little bit of background on the programs, why they exist, and yeah, just kind of what's happening here in the Valley. Do you want to dive in, Abby?
Yes, and then some of you are familiar with me. I'm Abby Zarnecki. I'm your Angler Education Coordinator for the Southern region. And I met Sarah through our CUYA group, where we do a lot of outreach and education, especially to our Clark County School District, and just saw a great opportunity and partnership with some great information to get out so that we can keep our clean water safe for our wildlife. And so with that, I will get this presentation started. I actually have both of your presentations open right now, so I'm trying to make sure I start the right one.
Either way.
Okay.
Either way, it's fine.
I hit present. There we go. And new share should be this one.
Looks good, thanks. All right, let's just get right on it.
There we go.
Okay, let's see.
Setting it off the top.
It is a little bit, but that's okay. All that title says is the Cuyahoga River. That's just to give you an idea of what you're actually looking at in the picture. This is a river in Cleveland, Ohio, which has been a major industrial city since the 1880s. And for a long time, the city and its residents were just allowed to pour anything into the river. So it kind of coined this identity as an open sewer through the center of the city. And that's because before the 1970s, there was no regulation on a local, state, or even federal level about what we can release into our local waterways. And so in 1969, there was a fire that broke out on the Cleveland River because of all of the chemicals. And it really kind of became this symbol showing how out of control water pollution was in this country. And that basically led to the Clean Water Act being passed. And so that happened 1 year later in 1970, the first year that Earth Day was enacted. And since then, the EPA has federal programs that are in place to control what is discharged and runs off into our local waterways. Next slide. Okay. So runoff, like any kind of urban runoff gets into our waterways mostly through stormwater runoff. And stormwater is just literally rain that runs over our paved surfaces. And as it does that, anything it comes into contact with is going to pick up. So trash, cigarette butts, chemicals, maybe oil from a leaky vehicle. The water is going to pick all that up and bring it into our local water bodies, washes, streams, rivers, and lakes. And we all saw what the consequences of what polluted stormwater runoff can do. You saw that in the previous slide. Next slide, please. And so this really has an impact on a watershed level. And so just to give you a little bit of an idea of like what a watershed is, it's basically just a region of land that drains all the precipitation and snowmelt into a single body of water. They vary greatly in shape and size, but it's important to know that they are bound on all sides by either mountains or a local waterway, stream, lake, ocean, river, that sort of feature. No matter where you are on planet Earth, you will be standing in a watershed of some kind. Here in the Las Vegas Valley, we live in the Las Vegas Valley watershed, which I'm sure we've all heard is part of the larger Colorado River watershed, one of the largest watersheds in the United States. And so again, the watersheds are bound on all sides by some sort of mountainous or river feature. Abby, can you go to the next slide, please? This map is meant, let's see, there we go. Everything shown in yellow on this map is showing you the outline of the Las Vegas Valley watershed. So you might be able to identify, oh, one more down. There we go. You might be able to identify on the western boundary of this yellow area is the Spring Mountains. And so you can kind of get a sense how the watershed is defined. But what's important to know is that, again, all of the water, snowmelt precipitation, is going to drain into those blue lines, which represent our washes and channels. And all of those flow into the Las Vegas Wash and then into Lake Mead. So that's kind of the flow path of stormwater in the Las Vegas Valley watershed. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, stormwater can become very polluted from all sorts of everyday human activities. Some of them you're probably very familiar with, so I won't dawdle on them for too long, but essentially what they all have in common is that none of these sources of pollution are from one single point, meaning like not all of the pet waste is being released from one location, right? It's people all across the city that are releasing pet waste. So all of these sources of pollution have multiple points of entry into the system. Next source, please, or next slide, please. And so we've talked a lot about stormwater in Las Vegas on like a watershed level, but let's hone it in a little bit. So us as residents, we know that all of the water that's used, let's start with indoors, something we're familiar with, flows down our drains, sinks, and then eventually will enter our sewer pipes and go to the wastewater treatment plant where it's treated and cleaned. And then it's released into the water as shown on the right-hand side of the diagram. But on the left-hand side, again, it's just kind of showing that anything outdoors, all of our rainwater flows, maybe picks up vehicle oil, goes into the storm drain where it's not treated, And then for us, all of that untreated stormwater, polluted stormwater, flows into Lake Mead, which is our local source of drinking water. Next slide. And so the more developed an area becomes, definitely increases the amount of stormwater runoff that occurs. And that's because in like a bare desert soil, the soil itself is very porous, and so water is allowed to infiltrate. And some of it will either become deep groundwater or stay more shallow. And the more developed an area becomes, the more of that porous surface you're paving over, which basically means that it can't infiltrate anymore. So if you compare the image in the top left to the image on your top right, you can definitely see that the more urban an area becomes, the less infiltration there is, increasing runoff and the likelihood that it's going to pick up any pollutants. All right, next slide, please. And so this is really just kind of meant to hone it in and show you how things scale up over 30, 40 years, 50 years in this case. The population in Las Vegas has essentially increased by about 100%. So, you know, just think about that as more paved surfaces, more people, more sources of pollution, more runoff. It all kind of starts to make sense when you look at it from the numbers. Next slide, please. And so I really just want to address that. I know we're in a desert environment. So like, why are we talking so much about stormwater? Because it hardly rains here. Valid point. I understand. But the truth is that the infrequent rain events just mean that that is more time for all of the pollutants to accumulate in our cities, on our roads, on our shorelines, until the next big major rainstorm occurs. And then we get a high concentration of pollutants flushed into our storm drains, our Las Vegas wash, and then eventually to Lake Mead. Next slide, please. And so I know we're all here because we want to understand how to better keep our water clean for the animals. So these are just some of the critters that live along the Las Vegas wash and in Lake Mead. So lots of cute desert reptiles, birds, fish, and then the cute little pack rats. So, you know, all of these animals rely on the local water sources. And so the more trash that gets in there, the more likelihood they may be to pick something up. And so preventing it really is just a really simple message I like to tell people, is that clean water starts with you. So much of the pollutants that we've talked about so far are honestly preventable just through good housekeeping measures. So, you know, we all kind of just do our part. I know it's a message that we learned a long time in elementary school, but it honestly holds a lot of truth to this topic. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. So I've been talking a lot about the Las Vegas wash. In case none of you have ever been out there, this is a snapshot of it. It's a beautiful wetlands in the middle of the desert. They've put a lot of work into restoring it, getting rid of the invasive species and repopulating native plants, native birds and fish as well. So I would definitely recommend that you check it out if you haven't been there. Okay, next slide. And so again, I just wanted to touch on drought because this is a topic that we hear a lot about, and stormwater actually does play an important role, because if you remember, stormwater is a main source of pollution being brought into our lake, and the drought is only going to continue to most likely decrease the lake level in the lake. So there's going to be less water, but more than likelihood, the city is just going to continue to grow in size. And so if we think about growing population, probably more pollution, but lower lake levels. And it's just kind of a bad feedback cycle, because the concentrations of the pollutants are only going to continue to accumulate. Just want to point out that the water is treated once it's taken out of the lake. Okay. The Las Vegas Valley Water District has a very amazing, sophisticated, some of the best in the world water treatment system. So everything that comes out of our taps is 100% safe, and none of the pollution that we're talking about we ever see, in our homes. But if we go to the lake, then we start to kind of see some of the floatable trash and stuff like that. So I just kind of wanted to mention that in case there was any confusion. Okay. So yeah, we've talked a lot about stormwater pollution, but now I kind of want to get into some more like concrete examples. So let's just get right into it. Abby, next slide, please. All right, so biggest sources of residential pollution are trash and debris, litter, landscaping debris, and then cigarettes. Oil from vehicles, grease from, again, like industrial processes, or sometimes even grease from your kitchens. People will sometimes take it outside and dump it, and all of that has very negative effects on our water quality. Pet waste is actually a big issue because it contains lots of bacteria and viruses, which are known to definitely harm, a lot of, well, aquatic environments, and birds tend to be the most heavily impacted from these sorts of pathogens. Sediment, metals also can create some issues because they have elements and minerals sorbed to them, which you'll see in a few minutes what some phosphorus sediments did to the lake. I have this photo of that to kind of show you. It actually is a bigger deal than it sounds. Some other sources are, sometimes people don't, this is more of an industrial issue, but large apartment complexes, or sometimes larger residential communities won't properly service their sanitary sewer lines, and raw sewage will leak out onto the roads, and that could get into storm drains. So a multitude of sources, essentially anything that we do here in the cities can be a stormwater pollutant. All right, next slide, please. So this is not a photoshopped photo. This is a real aerial photo that was taken of the algae bloom that took place in Lake Mead in 2001. And what caused this algal bloom was high concentrations of phosphorus that were flowing into the lake, most likely from high amounts of sediment that entered it somehow. And so the algae just love phosphorus. It's kind of like their food source. And so they just went completely, they just exploded this particular year. Since then, there's been a very active monitoring program on the lake to make sure that phosphorus levels don't get to these levels again. But this is just what some of the water quality impacts that sediment can actually have on our waterways. Next slide, please. So again, just wanted to show you guys some more examples. The top two photos are taken right from, I think the photo on the left is one of the concrete channels, and the photo on the right is in the wetlands park, but just literally showing you what happens when all of that accumulates in our waterways. Photo on the left is just kind of a funny ad. It's kind of a satire. It's showing you not to wash your car on a lake because you see all the suds and things like going into the water. Soap suds is going to cause nutrient levels to spike, which could, of course, cause some kind of like algal bloom or maybe some other issue. And then the photo on the right is just showing what can happen when there's construction sites stockpiling sediment without proper stormwater controls. You can just see how the whole background and foreground, really as far as I can see, is brown with sediment. And here are actually two of the same pictures, but important takeaway from this slide is that all of that trash, debris is going to be discharged to Lake Mead without a single ounce of treatment. Okay, next slide. All right, I'm sure everybody has a really good understanding of stormwater pollution now, but like what are some of the things that we can all do? I touched on it earlier. It's a lot of like good housekeeping practices. So if we want to get specific, this diagram shows that like down here in the front, we always want to make sure that we apply our fertilizers and our pesticides, any lawn chemicals, according to manufacturers' guidelines. We want to pick up after our pet waste. We never want to pour any kind of waste down the drain, doesn't matter what it is. Most likely it's going to harm it in some way. So general rule of thumb, only rain down the storm drain. That's our slogan here at the Clark County Water Quality Group. Another thing that you want to do is you want to regularly check your car for leaks and oils. We've received multitude of residential complaint calls about people servicing cars in their driveways or neglecting to service their cars in their driveways. And so, you know, if you just are on top of it and you take it to a mechanic, we won't get called for a complaint and everybody wins. It's just a good thing for everyone. All right, next slide. So just a few kind of more clear-cut tips for ways that you can help. I mean, a lot of it's pretty much the same. You want to use a commercial car wash so that none of the soap suds are getting into our storm drains. Again, you want to maintain your vehicle, scoop pet poop. You want to dispose of your pool water into the sanitary sewer system if you can. And that's because if you discharge your pool into the streets, it can cause flooding and be kind of a nuisance flow, and it also contains chlorine, which can harm our water quality as well. So you don't want to be releasing your pool water into the storm drains. Yeah, but other than that, I think we've covered most of the tips already. Again, just be responsible with how you apply your yard chemicals and make sure you throw your trash and recyclables away. And so if any of you are curious and would like to learn more about our Only Rain in the Storm Drain program, there's a fun interactive educational website called Stormwater Vegas that you're free to visit. There you can learn more about our program and more pollution prevention tips for residents, or if you have any friends and family in the manufacturing or construction industry, we cover those tips in those areas as well. And so just to kind of wrap up what we kind of all talked about, we talked about stormwater and that it originates as precipitations during storms. But once that water hits our pavement, it does not soak into the ground or absorbed, and it becomes stormwater runoff. That runoff, as we know, picks up pollutants as it flows through our streets. Some of the pollutants are concerns, trash oil, hazardous chemicals, dirt, bacteria. And the goal of all of this is to try to reduce the amount of those non-point source pollutants so that we can improve the runoff or the quality of our stormwater runoff. And, you know, that has an impact down the line for the aquatic environments where our fish live. So I hope you guys found that interesting and that you learned something. Again, my name is Sarah and I'm with Clark County Water Quality. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take them.
All right, if you think of any questions, you can ask Sarah as we continue just to touch a little bit more on water quality with the storm drain prevention and ways it affects the wildlife. Keep switching screens. All right. So as Sarah touched on earlier, home means Nevada, and being a good angler starts at home and not having our gutters and streets look like this. So because like she said, there's green sunfish in the washes. And then another thing to take into consideration is those smaller fish get eaten by birds that migrate. So we are part of the Pacific Flyway. And so she had a great picture of the blue heron. You can see them. It's really neat on the shores just outside the marina, the Hemingway Marina. And you can literally see them eating the smaller fish. So if we have contaminated waters because of our storm drains and into the washes, and it doesn't get filtered out enough, those birds that actually recreate in the washes as well because of the great shelter, they're going to take it wherever they go to. So like up north, sometimes we have botulism outbreaks, and that's because of the birds that aren't healthy. Or we can see it at, like, especially at Sunset Park, actually a lot of our parks, the birds almost look greasy, or you can see it actually in my grocery store parking lot. You can tell that the birds have been eating greasy leftovers out of the garbage and are totally just covered in it, or the food off the ground is greasy and they're eating it. So those birds go into the waters with our fish, and that's our major connection here, is keeping our waters clean every bit we can do. And I know there's the saying, just one thing, but honestly, as many things as you can do, because it all adds up. We're in an urban environment, especially down here. All right, and here's Michelle.
Thank you, Abby. So, like Sarah mentioned, everything starts from home, and that includes being a good angler. And to do so, we want to take the extra steps to plan ahead, and that starts with prepping at home. So, this could help reduce any waste that you have that you bring outside if you open everything and get everything ready for your trip while you're still at home. And bring a trash bag for any trash that you have, in addition to any that you may come across while you are out at the lake or any other part of the great outdoors. And bring a net if you're planning to fish or even catch some trash that may be floating in our waters. And this is a picture of a razorback sucker, one of our endangered species that live in our Lake Mead. So think of where your garbage goes. You always want to pack out what you pack in, reuse whatever you can, and always dispose of your waste properly. And if you've been over to Lake Mead, you've noticed these trash receptacles that we have out at the lake, which is always a good option to have if we don't have any trash bags that we bring with us. But if you do open those, remember to keep them closed so that the wind doesn't pick up any trash and blow it into the water, and it also prevents any birds, like Abby mentioned, from getting into that trash. And Sarah went through a great explanation of all of those non-point source pollutions that start over in our city that runs off into the lake, that creates these dead zones where there's not a lot of healthy bacteria, and the pollution that runs over into the lake results in a lot of our native species being injured or dying because the lake is no longer healthy. And How Is My Waterway is a great resource that is from EPA, and it is a website where you can enter a location, whether it be your community, your local community that's nearby, or even if you just put Lake Mead as a whole, it will show you the conditions of the water bodies near you and whether it's safe for swimming, eating those fish that you catch, the aquatic life nearby, and drinking water. So we are in the process of rolling out a program called Don't Ditch a Fish. And this is similar to Don't Let It Loose, if you've heard of that program before. And the whole premise of it is to prevent people from letting their fish go into a body of water, whether it's a pond, a lake, or flushing it down the toilet even. Those fish can become invasive and outcompete any native fish that we have and just kind of mess up the ecosystem in an unhealthy manner. So if you ever find yourself in a situation where you can no longer house your pet fish, try your best to rehome it, whether it be donating it to a library, a school, or an office, or you can even try selling it back to any pet stores nearby. A lot of them do support this program because they understand how important it is to keep our waterways and lake healthy. So if you have any questions about not being able to care for your pet fish anymore, you can visit don'tletitloose.com so that we can try to make sure that our waterways and lakes stay clean and healthy.
All right, and so to wrap it all up, we're going to respect our waters, and that's how we're going to be an ethical angler. And then we're going to also protect the land and your fellow anglers. So just by doing all the stuff Sarah and Michelle have talked about, keeping our home healthy, and that includes our yards and streets outside of our house, you're respecting others. Let them go and grow. We always put that in there. We like to keep the middle fish. They give you great fillets, and the big ones are left in the water, and so are the small ones. And then that way they can reproduce, or they can get bigger to reproduce. And that includes selective harvesting, just keeping the fish that you're actually going to eat. And also be very conscious if you do like to eat fish. One more reason we want to keep our waters clean, and then preserve your passion, protect the legacy, and spread the word. So spread fish camp, spread the fun interactive storm drain things from kids. I was telling Sarah before we started that I do remember like knowing not to put stuff in the drain. I don't remember where from, but it's been embedded in me, and I grew up in Vegas. So I want to say the city of Las Vegas did pretty good with some commercials. And as the city grew, it's, protect the legacy. And I grew up heading down to Lake Mojave and stuff like that just to get out of town too. And I left this in there, but we don't have to. If you're going fishing, have your license, pack it in, pack it out, be prepared before you go, and check the weather. Especially if you go to places like Willow Beach or anywhere that's a wash, literally Kingman Wash. And a lot of it flows right down into the valley. So make sure your stuff is cleaned up and you're safe and prepared for our changes in weather. And Sarah had an awesome video of the debris, just the land debris rushing and creating washes. And Zion had an amazing flood, I want to say this spring, about it. So please ask us any questions or any connections you've made or think of, please let us know. We'll stay on for a couple more minutes. And here's my email address. And we saw Sarah's earlier. We can put them in the chat for you. And let us know if you have any questions. And I can forward questions to Michelle for you guys as well. I'll put these in the chat. Thank you very much. There's also the survey again on your way out. I'll stop sharing. There we go. I can get you the contacts. Are there anything you think that you do awesome at home that helps keep our storm drains clean? Or do you remember seeing like a cool storm drain sign while you're out? Some of the sketch arts I think is always fun around the washes or the drains.
I know we have put a lot of time and effort into putting these little plaques on all the storm drains in the county. It was in my presentation. It was a little round green and blue placard with Kip the fish. It says, "Don't pollute, drains to Lake Mead." So we have that here, but I grew up in Los Angeles near the ocean, and for my whole life, I think there was a storm drain outside my childhood home, and there's a big stencil in the ground that says, "Don't pollute, drains to ocean." So it's been around for a while.
Yeah, definitely. I know I saw one at the Target or Costco parking lot too. Took a picture of it, I think. And one,
Yeah, and we actually give out plaques if anybody
oh, very
is
cool.
living or working in unincorporated Clark County and they notice that maybe people aren't aware that there's a storm drain or where it might lead to, you can just send in a request to our waterquality@cleanwaterteam.com inbox. Or yeah, there you go. Please reach out to me. I'll mail them to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Sarah and Michelle, for presenting today. Awesome having you on. And thank you for attending, the audience. And we'll have our next session at 5:30, and we're going to talk about all kinds of awesome community ponds in our urban areas. And we're using Google Earth, so it's actually pretty neat.